The fixer or filler? Two questions you need to ask. There are two main types of people you'll come across in your leadership journey. I'll call them fixers and fillers. These are not just cheap stereotypes or labels, they're just convenient terms that have helped me sort through all the various personality types and needs and desires of people that you'll be called on to lead. It's important right here to qualify this by saying that everyone you meet is a unique individual, has different needs, but we're talking here about maximizing your ability to provide a solution in a more effective way. Just to be straight. The first type of person, and I only categorize like this in order to prioritize my response to their need. The first type of person will need leading from a place of brokenness to a place where the brokenness can be fixed. Once again, please be open to the terminology. The second type of person is, for all intents and purposes, fixed. Their broken areas have mostly been restored to wholeness, and this person will need leading into a place where they can begin to be filled. So the uncomfortable question that you need to ask is this person in front of me a fixer, or is this person a filler? This may seem like a cut and dried notion, but it's very important if you don't want to be wasting your time trying to achieve something that's just not suitable. And let's be honest, your time as a leader and as a person is important, right? There's nothing more frustrating than investing your time, experience, and expertise into someone who just seems to go and waste it. But that's exactly what will happen if you try to pour all your great leadership equipping stuff into a broken person. It's like pouring clean, fresh water into a bucket with a giant hole in it. When I teach this principle in seminars, I like to use a visually memorable scenario. I get some volunteers. I take 2 500 milliliter bottles of water, a large clear bowl, and a sharp knife. I ask the first question about the capacity of the bottle, which is obviously 500 milliliters. I then ask a volunteer to pierce the bottle approximately a third of the way up from its bottom with a knife. The water contained in the bottle begins to pour out into the bowl. Then I pour the contents of the second bottle into the first, and we all watch it pour straight out again. I then ask the next question: what is its capacity now? People usually say 500 milliliters. And then I make this point: its capacity now is at the level of its wound. This wound could be some kind of moral failure, or the loss of a loved one, or a job. In fact, there are lots of different ways that something from outside can penetrate our lives, causing pain and even leading to infection. Paraphrasing a common saying, a wounded person can either bleed over people who didn't cut them. This is the reality of working with a fixer. Your goal should firstly be to identify and help to bring healing or restoration to the wound, whatever that may be, as that will stop a person from retaining anything good or even positive that's poured or invested into them. And the reality is that this can happen to any of us at any time. The other type of person you'll come across is the filler, who is like the bottle but without a hole in it. And they are open and ready and hungry to be filled. But you keep trying to fix them and not fill them. If you do that, there will be 2 frustrated people in the equation and a lot of valuable time wasted. I don't like unnecessary and especially limiting labels, but some labels are helpful. An obvious example is tins of food. Imagine not having labels on them. Think of the wasted time involved in opening them without knowing what they contain. You get the point. Therefore, I think it's important to take a look at these 2 types of people in a little bit more depth, and how you recognize their different needs so that you can lead them in the right way without the burden of frustration and wasted effort that comes from doing the wrong thing with the wrong type of person. So, By my definition, fixers are people who are broken in some area of their life, be it mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, and who don't have the capacity to receive or retain what you give them. Fillers are people who are not broken in the same way anymore and have the capacity to accept and, more importantly, process correctly and retain what you pour into them. So, looking at these two types in more depth to begin with, we can recognize some of their identifying features. But before we look at them individually, it's important to remember a couple of things that mark the difference between people you can help and people you can't help. Because the reality is that there are a few that are simply not ready even to be fixed unless some things change in their perspectives or attitudes. Until or unless these changes happen, your best recourse as a leader is to make sure you have secure emotional boundaries in place while doing whatever you can to maintain them in a safe and stable condition. It's frustrating, but there are some common traits that I've encountered, and knowing them will keep you from spending valuable time that could be better used for someone else. I know that for some people reading this, it might sound too cut and dried, but please believe me when I say that working with broken, hurting people on the front lines of life can at times force you to use a form of spiritual triage. I've made many mistakes. I've ended up at times working with people who won't change, while there are others who desperately want and need the right input to propel them forward on the trajectory of transformation that are missing out. So here's some of the main characteristics of people who won't be helped. Notice I didn't say can't be helped. Those who do not take responsibility for themselves. When there are continual excuses for mediocrity or failure and everyone else is blamed for whatever the problem is, it's impossible to make any forward progress. Someone who is unrepentantly irresponsible is going to be unfaithful, as faithfulness primarily has to do with owning and completing tasks. The irresponsible person will never finish what they're given to do, and it will be everyone else's fault why they didn't, including yours. Then there's those who are not transparent. There are also some people who create distance so they're not reachable or accountable and only let others get so close before cutting them off. They do this because they fear allowing anyone, especially an authority figure, to see them for who they really are. Often they're hiding or withholding something about themselves, and that makes it impossible to treat the problem in the right way. It's a bit like going to see a doctor with a bleeding wound and leaving with pills for a bad back because of not disclosing the real need. It's almost impossible to help someone with this mindset. Next, we have those who live in self-deception. Some broken people think they're doing fine, even when it's obvious to everyone else that they're not. They learn to justify and normalize their situation and so stay the same. The big problem is that denial is the first step to deception, and this can in fact come up with some type of false reality that continually feeds their thoughts and feelings the things they want to hear about themselves and their key relationships. If you try to point this out to them, they become upset and blame you for either not understanding them or wrongfully accusing them of something. Then there's those who insist on having a negative outlook on life. These people always seem to expect the worst in life, so they're never disappointed in anything or anyone, so whatever you do for them is never going to be enough. This is so draining. My wife and I worked with a woman once that never remembered any good thing that was done with her or for her. Whenever we wanted to speak to her, it was always going to be something negative. And I mean always. It was like that for 10 years. That dark cloud can suck the joy out of everything it touches. So there comes a time when you realize it's time to look at a different strategy. One really important concept that gets overlooked or isn't understood is that good leadership doesn't work without good followership. And some people just don't follow very well. They can either try to stop the healing of their wound or even keep opening it back up. And there comes a point when you just have to move on from that. Because the reality is that there are some people you can't help to grow because they won't do what needs to be done. Before we move on, though, I've noticed that there is something that needs to be recognized in the makeup of those who want to help broken people. Sentimentality. Becoming sentimental with a broken person can even lead to codependent behavior, and this is a trap. Leaders can't be sentimental, just as a doctor in an emergency department can't be sentimental either. Leading broken people needs the right heart, but it's also going to take the right mentality. That's why it's important to love people, but not to death. It's a sobering thing to realize that some broken people don't want to be fixed because being broken gets them the attention that they crave. So with that in mind, let's look at our two types of people who can be helped, even though they're helped in different ways. Number one, fixers. Fixers are people with holes or wounds. In other words, they need fixing and, where necessary, healing. The difference with these people from those above is that even if they weren't aware of it at first, when you show them that they're leaking, they respond in the right way. Identifying this particular need is key. If you were to see a container that had a gaping hole in it, it's quite obvious that you wouldn't pour anything precious into it. It will pour straight out and be wasted. Some people who will cross your path will be like this. They will have a hole or a wound that has become apparent, and it might seem hard to help these people at first, but it's actually very simple. You just have to identify the hole and then fix it. And following are some common wounds that you'll probably come across. Sin. From a Christian perspective, everyone starts off with this hole due to their disconnection from the Creator God. And this hole can only be fixed by Jesus through faith and repentance, as it is Jesus and Jesus alone who offers forgiveness and reconciliation with God. For some people, that fixes them, and then they're off and running in terms of their capacity to be filled. Because repentance necessarily isn't about turn. It's a change of mind or thinking or perception. Once this happens, a new direction is enabled with new potential and possibility. There's still a journey to travel with all the ups and downs, but the directional perspective is better. Then there's trauma. This is big and can come from different events, an accident or bullying, domestic violence or childhood neglect. How about war? We have a generation of battle-scarred servicemen and women dealing with the effects of the decades-long war on terror, who have wounds that often can't easily be seen, as well as those with life-changing injuries. Any one of these things can wound a person, and while some are long-lasting and often become buried, most can also happen at any time in life. I've personally worked with people suffering from all of these at one time or another, from adults struggling with shame caused by childhood abuse, to ex-soldiers suffering from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Even my wife was wounded in this way when she was diagnosed with bone cancer, or, as it's clinically termed, parosteal osteosarcoma. This was in her left leg. In 2011, she was diagnosed. After what can reasonably be considered a miraculous intervention, and this is the consultant's statement, she didn't have her leg amputated, but instead is now the owner of the longest prosthetic implant of its kind in the world, a 24-centimetre silver-coated titanium bone, including a knee and tibia, inside her own skin. The outcome was better than we hoped for, but the trauma wounded her, and it didn't heal for years. Then there's loss. Loss of a loved one especially, or possibly even a job or a role that the person enjoyed or had always desired. The loss of a loved one is one of those hard but simple things. Hard due to its impact and the scope of the damage caused, but simple in you know what needs to be focused on. This type of loss is markedly different from others and is by no means a quick fix. It takes time, lots of it, to get through, and often it never gets fixed completely. Sometimes it just stops being all-consuming, but it's always there in the background. The loss of a relationship or a job or a role might be different in size and shape to that of a loved one, but once you identify one of these, you can begin the process of reconstruction. It's never easy, but at least you know what's causing the breakdown. Identity issues. From low self-esteem on one hand to misplaced pride on the other, an unstable sense of who a person is can leave a gaping hole in their reality. Until it's healed, that person will struggle to retain anything you give them in terms of information or responsibility because they keep getting lost in themselves. If you imagine a sat-nav or a GPS in your car, before you can enter a destination or receive any directional instructions, you have to have your location locked into position. This is where a person's identity is so crucial, as it locks us in positionally in life. So to fix this hole, there needs to be a time of reorientation. Who are they? What are they supposed to be doing? These are a couple of the questions that need to be asked and answers offered to take them to get hold of this situation. When this happens, it's incredible how many other problems fade away. Then there's attachment issues, rejection. Not everyone forms strong attachments as infants, and far too many people grow up in broken, dysfunctional families. Sometimes there's been sickness or depression that's created a relational distance as people grew up, and they struggle to form healthy bonds. Rejection is also a huge problem for many and can create a performance trap that they keep falling into. So building trust and healthy connections is a key component in helping someone with these very real issues break free from the destructive cycle that they might be trapped in. Some of this could take a long time as the wounds won't always close up quickly. But that's not always a bad thing if there's some deep-rooted poison that needs fully draining out. So patience is necessary. I've even ministered to people for more than 10 years as one of their wounds keeps reopening. But the desired end result is always healing, even though it's possible that in reality, some extreme cases may not be fully healed this side of eternity. Lastly, there's addiction. Maybe surprisingly, addiction is not, in my experience, a primary hole or wound. It's more like an infection that gets into a wound and spreads, causing destruction. Often when an addiction is overcome physically, there remains a real possibility that it will return if the wound or hole it entered through is still there. Using the analogy of a tree, the addiction is the fruit, but the wound is the root. To fully deal with the fruit and stop it growing, you have to deal with the root. When the root problem is addressed, the fruit of the addictive behavior can dry up and grow no more. The temptation will always be there, but the need will be gone, which makes identifying root issues incredibly important when working with an addict. But this takes time and the building of a relationship based on trust and commitment. And sadly, there are not many places an addict can go to where this can happen. The lazy answer is to prescribe another drug to maintain and hopefully reduce the dose until the person is clean. But far too many times that just leaves the person, as we've said before, as a junkie without a habit. It's just what I term fruit picking. The problem is that fruit season will come back round again. And if the original tree of addiction is still alive, the result will be relapse, and the terrible cycle will begin again. Christian programs, especially the residential ones, are ideally suited to dealing with this challenge as they're generally holistic, meaning that they look at the person as a whole and take time to address the real areas of need. In Victory Outreach International, since the beginning of the ministry in 1967, we've seen literally hundreds of thousands of lives transformed to various degrees, from the basic breaking of an addiction to the building of those lives into people fulfilling their potential in life. It's not easy, but if you'll take the time, it's really worth it. Getting fixed. Some of the phases of realization that a wounded soul has to go through to be fixed are: I need to be fixed, which is acceptance. I want to be fixed, which is desire. I can be fixed, which is determination. I am being fixed, which is realization. I have been fixed, which is a new reality. There's also a significant difference between having a wound and a scar. A wound is something that's still causing a problem. Maybe it's still fresh or causing pain, or it's still bleeding. Sometimes it was on the way to being healed, maybe it even scabbed over, but then something caught it and opened it back up. Or, more worryingly, the wounded person either wouldn't leave it alone and kept picking at it, or it's become infected again and it's seeping poison. The wound. Wounds still need to be healed. And you will come across the walking wounded from time to time. Those people who believe they can stagger forward regardless of the problems they have. Sometimes it's misplaced loyalty or bravery, but mostly it's simply a lack of self-care. At some stage, they need to be carefronted, not just confronted, with the reality that their situation is very real and they need and can get their wound healed. The main difference between these two, carefronting and confronting, is the attitude it's being done with. Carefronting is more of a concerned identification more than just a pointing out of the problem. If this is not done, these wounds will cause added problems over time until the wounded one will eventually collapse. And if that happens at the wrong time, it could be disastrous for you and those associated with that person. There's nothing more tiring than dealing with unnecessarily leaky people. The scar. A scar, on the other hand, was a wound at one time but has been healed. What remains is a mark or a memory that something tried to destroy that person but failed. It's commonly thought that successful people don't have any of these problems, but the truth is that most, if not all, successful people are covered in scars of one type or another, because successful people are just those who refuse to let their last failure be their last failure. So scars are healed wounds. They're also badges of honor. Be proud of your scars, because they are a living legacy of your victories over defeat. And make sure the people you work with recognize the difference. Recognizing a fixed person. As a leader looking for people to pour into, I always look for the evidence of scars. For the most part, they show that the person in question has overcome some heavy things, and that gives them a certain substance which can be very useful to their further development. In my experience, I think that you can recognize a fixed person by their directional perspective. Are they constantly looking back to their problems, or are they looking forward from their problems? The direction of their focus will determine whether or not it's time to really start investing in them. After all, it isn't always easier to lead someone who's facing the wrong direction, right? It's always easier to lead someone who's facing the right direction. Fillers are people who don't need to be fixed right now. They're people with actual capacity, because they have this real capacity they can be filled and poured into. All the wisdom and experience and knowledge that you've gained can be deposited in someone like this, because they will always be able to retain it and use it in the right way. I found it incredibly refreshing to work with someone who is open and hungry to learn, because when you pour out what's inside you, it makes room to be filled up again yourself. This principle can be seen in the Apostle Paul's letter to his disciple Timothy, which is part of the New Testament. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "And the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." In another version, it translates like this: "You have heard me teach things that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Now teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others." Paul first reminds Timothy that the stuff he's sharing actually works and has been reliably confirmed. This is important, I think, as it provides a sense of reality to what's being shared. The quoting of other people is great in an academic setting, but what is more powerful is when you can actually apply what you're teaching to instances in your own life. After all, as we've already seen, it's easier and more effective to follow footsteps than signposts. Another thing that is key to this process is to understand that you're number 2 in a 4-part process of forward growth. We should all be following somebody, and then we should all be training somebody else who can then do the same. If this ideal was to be fully realized, we would see amazing transformation take place in our societies. Then Paul sets out his standards of the people he's looking to pour into. There's 2 criteria. They need to be faithful and able. This is a really important combination if you don't want to waste your time by pouring the wrong thing into the wrong person. Here's an equation I've used that's helped me. Faithfulness minus ability equals fantasy. Ability minus faithfulness equals frustration. Faithfulness plus ability equals fruitfulness. The first scenario is where there's someone who always turns up for football practice but just can't play football. They're faithful but just not able. Or how about the one who turns up regularly and on time for every choir practice, but then they open their mouth to sing and they sound like a wolf? It's all a fantasy. By all means, find some way to reward their faithfulness. Just don't make the mistake of empowering their fantasy. Otherwise, someone will end up hurt. The second scenario is when you know the person in question can do what needs to be done, sometimes even better than you, but they either don't turn up or they're constantly late. Isn't that so frustrating? They have all the talent in the world, but they either take it for granted or they're just lazy. My dad used to tell me, hard work will always overcome talent that doesn't work hard. And I've seen people who, while not brilliant at what they do, become very competent at what they do simply due to their work ethic. I've also sadly seen brilliant people end up nowhere because they just weren't faithful with their gift. The last scenario is the ideal. People that turn up at the right time, on time, who have the ability, both natural and acquired, and just receive and retain everything you give them. And then when they in turn release it to other faithful men who do the same, the impact you can make is quite literally quadrupled. Now that's what I call being fruitful and effective. They're fillers. The most amazing thing I've discovered, though, is that people who have needed fixing often become the most effective future leaders. They're not striding off strongly in the wrong direction or even limping in the right direction. They're under no illusions as to what life is about, and they have faced the worst that can happen and have survived. So now they're grateful. And gratitude will affect your attitude, which will in turn affect your altitude. These are the ones who will do great things in a great way. They might not seem like there's many of these quality people, but I think that if more leaders were able to identify these things, it would open the floodgates of potential and possibility that are available in the lives of people who cross our paths. So therefore, try to identify the type of person you have in front of you as quick as possible. Is it a fixer? Is it a filler that is standing in front of you? Then you can tailor your efforts so that everyone you work with has the possibility to become everything they were created to be. So why not start immediately with those people in front of you today? Because in a year from now, you'd have wished you'd have started today.